Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Beth Egan, and I am the Director of Marketing here at YourEncore. And it's my privilege to introduce today's webinar, Remote Audits, Practical Guidance for Ensuring Effective Internal and Vendor Audits in the COVID-19 Era, which is being led by an exceptional team of experts from our Quality Center of Excellence, including Liz Wohl, Matthew Azuh, and Michelleanne Bradley. Before we begin, I wanted to quickly review a couple of small housekeeping items. All lines for today's webinar have been muted. That said, we will be opening the presentation for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Questions may be submitted electronically using the Q&A button found at the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation will run approximately 90 minutes, including Q&A. The presentation in its entirety will be recorded. This recording will be made available to you within the next few business days. You will receive an email from YourEncore when the recorded presentation becomes available. And with that, I will now happily turn this presentation over to Liz Wohl.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome everyone. I'm based here in Nashville, Tennessee, and I would just like to tell you a little bit about ourselves for our speakers. I am a research nurse, first and foremost, but I've also been in the clinical research industry for over 30 years with experience in clinical operations, training, design, delivery, and compliance, and procedural documents, quality management, with an emphasis on compliance and performance management and risk management here with YourEncore. I'm a certified CRA since 2000, which requires me to have over 24 hours of continuing education units every few years so that I remain current for both YourEncore and for you today. I'm a designated fellow for the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, and I'm also very passionate in helping organizations with training, quality management systems, and I've worked with biotechnology, pharmaceutical companies, CROs, academic health centers, the National Institutes of Health, and university administrator programs. I would like to now introduce Matt Azuh.
Thank you, Liz. This is Matt Azuh. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, our famous Windy City, and have been in the industry for approximately 23 years. 14 of those years have been devoted to consulting and have worked with YourEncore in the Center of Quality Center of Excellence for many, many years. I have an in-depth knowledge of regulatory compliance requirements in various country regulations, such as the FDA, TGA, PDMA, CMDR for Canada, PMDA for Japan, and VISTA for Brazil, SSA for Mexico, CFDA for China, and also with ISO 13485 and 9001. I have served in key quality assurance and regulatory affairs management positions and decision-making roles for approximately 17 years. And as I mentioned earlier, 14 years of those have been primarily in consulting and also involved in leading some organizations on behalf of YourEncore. I am a graduate of Loyola University, Chicago, with a bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry and MBA in global management. I'm here to assist with guiding you through these challenging times of COVID-19 and able to bring you hopefully up to date with remote auditing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelleanne Bradley, and I am also associated with the YourEncore Quality Center of Excellence. I started out in drug safety and pharmacovigilance and found a balance between quality assurance, PV, and IT. I've worked in very large organizations and very small organizations. Several times I have been the drug safety party of one, department of one. I have also transitioned from working for organizations to strictly consulting, and I have carried out quality, PV, and clinical audits all over the world and worked specifically in these areas where we find some pressure and pain points. And I'm really glad to be here today. This is one of my favorite parts of working with teams.
Thank you so much. What I would like to share with you all right now is the support that we are providing here at YourEncore during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a very specific program for not only risk assessments and evaluations, but also the framework and methodology to execute risk management and risk management plans and follow through into issue management. We support your clinical trial planning, your protocol development, and all of your amendments. We also assist you in driving your trial execution effectively during this time, helping you to reduce risk. We do provide remote mock inspections, remote audits, inspection readiness. We do have a very strong arm in regulatory intelligence and processing and policies because of the fact that we have experts around the globe who are assisting us in collating all of that information so that we have information right at our fingertips of what's happening in each country you may be doing your clinical trials in, or you may be going in to do your audits in. We also provide assessments of your technology and assist you with the implementation of wearables and remote technology. What we would like to do now, please, is if you all could put in the chat box, what is one thing you wanted to learn today from our webinar? Give everybody a few seconds here. Remote audit logistics, how to be efficient. How are we dealing with the challenges of EHR? Well, I can let you all know that the scope of this webinar is not site inspections. We plan on doing something in the future on that. Best practice for remote audits, how to be successful. How do you do a virtual audit with distributors? These are all excellent questions. Tools used for remote audits, how to feel confident about an audit without being there. Tips and tips to overcome the challenges. These are excellent points. I'm just going to load up a few more. Technology points. My question is about, just basically about audits to help with the tours technologies. We're going to touch on that as well. So regretfully, I have someone here who's saying, what is the scope of the audit of this webinar? It is for internal audits and vendor audits. So I just want to share that with you. And challenges of remote audits. These are all excellent points. Thank you. And I believe we're going to be able to address these today with our material. Our agenda is as follows. We're going to look at the learning objectives. We're going to benchmark the definition of a remote audit to an EMA definition for remote inspections. We're going to be giving you just a very brief update about the references for EMA, MHRA, and EMA that are out there for you to go in and reference after this webinar for further information about what they're doing with their on-site and the remote inspections. Then we're going to discuss audit preparation, audit planning, remote auditing, and then we're going to bring up a summary and a Q&A. We're going to be capturing your questions in the Q&A box, so please be sure to place those there. Our learning objectives are as follows. Describe select regulatory positions on remote auditing, including FDA, EMA, and MHRA. Evaluate the similarities and differences for the preparation and planning of remote versus on-site audits. And explain requirements for remote audit preparation, conduct, documenting, reporting, and follow-up. It's very important to understand that remote auditing doesn't exactly allow you to do all the exact same things on an on-site audit. And we're going to be sharing that information with you and some ways that you can do some assessments even though you're not on site. So it's very important for your organization to define what does a remote audit mean, what references are you using, and to ensure people are trained to how to conduct remote audits and how to prepare for remote audits. It's very important also to coach your auditee on how to prepare, and we're going to be discussing that today as well. Because we recognize there are some limitations present, but we are able to do a lot of attributes of audits remotely so that you can get a sense of how things are going. I just want to now share with you this benchmark definition, and this came out in May 2020 in the EMA document called Guidance on Remote GCP Inspections During the COVID-19 Pandemic. If you have not had a chance to review this, I believe you should, because it's very helpful and gives you a lot of great detail a lot of what we're presenting today, but because we're on this side of the stakeholder, we're going to be giving you a lot more detail than what the EMA guidance gives you, but it does give you some good information. The process of conducting inspections at a distance, virtually supported by technology for communicating, sharing, reviewing, developing documents, and accessing systems, without the inspectors being physically present at the sites where the activities subject to an inspection have taken place or where the inspection would routinely be hosted. Let me just share with you a few assumptions so that you understand what we're going to share with you today in this webinar and what we're not. You have a company policy on how to manage COVID-19. It's present and it has been reviewed. This has been a requirement from the FDA for a number of months. You already have auditing SOPs, tools, and templates for internal audits and vendor audits. For remote auditing, some companies are developing SOPs specifically for remote auditing. Other companies are not. What they're developing are procedures and business guidelines and auditor training separately. This is very much, I think, what your organization needs and what you need for QMS and ongoing quality with your auditors. So again, there's a lot of different ways people are doing this, but you have something in place. If you're conducting remote audits and you don't have any of this in place, this webinar is going to give you that information that you can use to actually insert into your business guidelines, your procedures, and your auditor training. Simulating an on-site audit? Yes, it does. Objectives, agenda, interviewees, flow, documents. Country region training on COVID-19 guidances and requirements of your auditors is key and critical, as you all know. That you have ongoing and current regulatory intelligence for each country and region. This is very critical to understand because this is how we maintain currency, not only with our trial management team, but also with our auditors. That you have identified and selected a technology solution to perform remote audit interactions and interviews with auditees. Auditees has access to all of their records, whether they are sitting inside of the company while you're doing remote audit or not. Here at YourEncore, when we have been doing remote audits for our clients globally, the staff have not been in the office and they were not coached to ensure they had access to all the documents in their system before we started the audit, so therefore the audit had to be extended. Document repository, this comes into your technology solutions that you've selected, tested, and you have the security and access controls already in place and decided upon. And that just like on-site audits, for remote audits, that you're going to be designating a plan for single auditor or multiple auditors that you ensure they run smoothly. So let's look at some of these select regulatory authority positions. During the COVID-19, FDA has been conducting remote, they call them remote assessments and on-site inspections. The on-site inspections have been what they call mission critical, as according to some of their higher priorities that they've communicated to industry, as well as COVID-19. But I want you to understand, with everything reopening, they published a statement that FDA prepares for resumption of domestic inspections with new risk assessment systems. And that's only going to be starting, look at this, domestic inspections, and it will give you how they're going to be deciding based upon the reopening of different states, counties, and regions in the US, how they're going to be doing those inspections. The MHRA has published on March 23rd of this year that they are conducting office-based assessments, which is basically documents and interviews. They are conducting on-site inspections when it's critical, but again, this is very much in alignment. EMA has been conducting remote inspections, and they also will be conducting some very targeted on-site inspections from what we have heard as well. So I recommend, if you haven't had a chance to look at all these documents as you prepare your remote auditing processes and procedures that you do, because it just helps you with that additional educational arm for your teams and your references for your procedures. We all know that ethical principles and guidelines in clinical research are the foundation for clinical research. We're going to still be able to look at computerized systems validation. We can still assess compliance with GCP. We can still assess compliance with human subject protections based upon the focus of the audit. Our privacy laws still apply, whatever those are around the globe. And again, as we all know, we're focusing our data integrity, quality, and reliability as we do with everything in clinical research. Now, what I would like to do is share with you a knowledge check. It's going to come up as a poll. Remote inspection and assessments are not being performed by which of the following regulatory authorities? Is it just FDA? Is it just EMA? Is it just MHRA? Or none of the above? All of them are actually conducting remote inspections and assessments. Wow, we're getting some great votes in here. Thank you. I know how many people we have attending. Just trying to let some more people get their answers in. So I want to share with you what the correct answer is. None of the above. So all of them are conducting remote inspections and assessments. Some of the on-site inspections might be either critical to the filing or can be related to COVID-19. So I just want to share that with you. Thank you. And now I am going to transfer this over to Matt for audit preparation.
Thank you, Liz. As most of you know, audit preparation is a very critical element of a successful audit. In fact, it's even more critical with remote auditing due to the logistical challenges that we often face when it comes to remote auditing, as we go into a greater detail about that as we progress in this presentation. Some audits take longer than others, and it could range from half a day to a day or even to multiple days in the case of, for an example, a CRO qualification audit. And in the case of a biostatistical audit, we may perhaps go for about half a day. So this will entirely depend on the scope of the audit. Advanced planning is really, really important for a remote audit to be successful. And there are a few elements here that I will share with you regarding advanced audit planning, and it's not by any means all exhaustive. Determination of an audit day with the auditee is very important in the preparation stages, and preferably 60 days in advance is recommended. Of course, there are cases where we don't have the luxury for 60 days advance notice. For an example, in the case of a for-cause audit. But whenever possible, it is highly recommended that you plan your audit much ahead of time. Another element to take into consideration in the audit preparation is the linguistic challenges. If you're auditing a country whereby the native language is not English, you want to obviously iron the details out on how information is going to be shared. Would the auditee translate all the documents in advance, or do you have a method locally on how to obviously translate those documents? Then the teleconference meeting to determine scope of the audit. It's important in these teleconference calls that you really understand what regulations are required or what regulations guide the audit of the area you intend to execute. You also want to know about local regulations. This will be a good time to discuss with the auditee and understand if there are some local requirements that you need to be aware. Then identification of names, phone numbers, and email addresses of key contact persons and their backups. This is really important because, of course, as we all know, people do take vacations. So if the primary contacts are not going to be available, you want to be able to reach out to the backups in the case of, again, preparing for the audit. Notification on the level of auditee's presence during the remote audit. So are you going to engage the auditee throughout the audit in a video conferencing, in a teleconferencing, or are you going to review the documents, and during the course of the review, do you require them to stay online? So those are the things that you really need to iron out with the auditee to ensure that a very successful audit. Auditor document request log used during the audit is also an important element. There are many ways to go about this. Sending a checklist or a log of documents that will be requested can be done in various forms, perhaps through email, through some other methods such as SharePoints, and also understanding in end of each day, auditor is to provide some sort of details as to what other documents will be required the following day. So these logistics need to be ironed out during the audit preparation. So be aware of the point on the auditee. In other words, this should be looked upon as a collaborative effort. So making the audit process less bothersome to the auditee is something that the auditor needs to recognize. There are obviously various time zones, and it could range. If you're located in the US, it could range from 6 hours in UK to 15 hours in Japan. So we need to take the time zone differences into consideration as to what will be the best and ideal time to conduct the audit. Then you need to talk about staff locations. In the case of the auditee, they may have SMEs, subject matter experts, that are located around multiple time zones. So we need to be cognizant of that fact during the audit preparation. Experience with remote audits. It doesn't hurt at all to ask the auditee if they have been exposed to remote auditing. So in light of that response, it would then help the auditor to narrow or tailor the questions that we need to be asked during the audit preparation. It's also important, again, as I mentioned earlier, to discuss about document repository. Are you going to be using SharePoint to share the documents that will be requested? Are you going to be using email or cloud-based method of communications? One thing that we need to watch out when it comes to emails is that, of course, some documents may be too big to transmit through that method. As for documents to be reviewed before the audit, this does not necessarily translate to actual audit, but in reviewing the documents and understanding the structure of the auditee's documentation, it helps the auditor to plan the audit adequately. Then image reviews, watching real-time images. Will you be looking at video recordings? Are we able to capture everything about the remote site, or are we being guided through selected images? Of course, in some cases, it will depend on the policy and procedures of the auditee in terms of what they are allowed to share. So interviews are also part of an audit. And in this case, you need to confirm if they have a stable internet connection. We all, I'm sure, have encountered this at some point in our business lives where we run into some hiccups with connectivities. So you need to make sure that you request that they have an IT support on a standby, because this is not one of those where we have to put a help desk ticket and wait for 24 hours for a response. Can the process and audit locations realistically be audited off-site, remote? There are cases, obviously, where this might be logistically challenging. And in that case, again, we need to iron all of those out during our preparation of the audit. Can you have a good overview of the facilities, the equipment, operations, processes, and controls? Again, video conferencing, real-time video recording may be the option, but again, it has to comply with the auditee's facility, policy, and procedures. Relationship in everything we do is certainly important. So show some personal concerns and consideration for their team, especially if auditees are in office. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's important, very, very important to be flexible. although we are going to have an agenda when we get to the next, I think a couple of slides further down the line, but it's important to be cognizant of their time as well. If an auditor doesn't feel the need to keep an auditee engaged in a video conferencing while they're actually reviewing a document, then you can sort of defer your questions and have them do whatever else that is within the scope of the audit without being engaged at every second of the audit process in a video conferencing or webcam. Again, it's important to dress professionally per company standard. Use a clean background, quiet location, and make eye contact. Most folks obviously are not used pre-COVID-19 pandemic working from home. So it's really important at this stage to discuss with the auditee the importance of keeping the environment quiet, especially if they are going to be engaging you potentially from their home office. Confirm in the letter and agenda about these very important audit preparation elements. And think with the end in mind. On-site audits will occur. Plan the right time for this with the auditees. Track country, region, state, reopening of the economies and businesses. Assess requirements, e.g. mandatory mask. So those things are very critical and important, especially in this very time. Now, audit plan. So in generating an audit plan, it's really, really important, as I mentioned earlier, to understand the scope and the objective of the audit. There are multiple regulations and standards out there, and of course, this is just an example of a few, and 1, 2, or 3 of these may apply in an audit. It doesn't necessarily imply that everything you see here is going to apply in audits. It just depends on the scope and nature of the audit that is being conducted. The reason why this is important, as we recognize when we get to reporting, is that in an audit scope, when you specify what the audit covers, it helps in your reporting of the actual audits and subsequent findings, if any. Okay, a typical audit format that I have used for many, many years, and of course, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, is laid out in this format where you have an audit time and location. And there are times, obviously, where you may be slightly ahead or behind in terms of the audit time, but work with the auditee to ensure enough flexibility so that if you're a little bit ahead of the audit agenda here, you can certainly rotate in terms of the individuals that you call upon to talk to regarding whatever quality system element is associated with their area. So again, building flexibility in remote auditing is really, really important. So as Liz mentioned earlier, in this new ISO 9001 remote auditing guidance that was published April 16th, 2020, there are some risk analysis elements that need to be considered in preparation for your audit. Confidentiality, security, and data protection. Could this be compromised or lead to policy violation of the auditee? Those are the questions, obviously, that you will need to pose to the auditee, who would better advise you on what their policies are regarding confidentiality, security, and data protection in the case of a remote audit. Use of ICT, information and communication technology, ensuring that there is a stable connection with good online connection quality. The ICT allows access to relevant documented information, including software databases, records, etc. It is possible to make the identification of interviewed people preferably with image. Again, going back to ensuring that the policy in place between the auditee and the auditor is not being violated as a result of this. Is it possible to access and interview people relevant for the QMS when conducting a remote audit? Of course it is, with proper planning and arrangements. If the organization is not operating regularly due to contingency situations, the process being evaluated should allow for fulfillment of the audit objectives. Complexity of the organization and audit type. In case of complex organizations, processes, or products and services, as well as where the objectives of the audit type require full assessment of the standard and wider sampling plan. This need to be taken into consideration in scoping your audit and obviously determining the length of time that will be required to perform an adequate remote audit. And in conclusion, the audit objectives can be attained with a remote audit. The audit objectives can be achieved partially. A remote audit may be done partially and then later complete the audit with an on-site audit. Again, these arrangements have to be determined ahead of time. The audit objectives can be attained via remote audit, as we have explained so far. So here are some examples of identification of risk and opportunities for using remote audit techniques. On the left column here, information and communication technology, video call for an example, Skype, WebEx, Zoom, Hangouts. Those are options that may be exercised depending on the policy of the auditee and the auditor. Potential use for these video calls could be conducting interviews, guiding site tours, documentary review with auditee participation. And of course, there are some risks as well associated with information and communication technology in a remote audit. You talk about security and confidentiality violations, but again, those need to be clearly understood between the auditee and auditor, and knowing what the local regulations are relative to information and communication technology and confidentiality. Of course, there are some opportunities or benefits to this as well. Interview with relevant personnel working remotely. Opening, closing meeting in multi-site audits. Remote site activities where physical observation is not critical. Travel time, cost reduction associated with environmental impact. Of course, in a case whereby we are conducting remote audits, we are saving money from a cost, from a travel expense standpoint, and also greater geographical range. So we are able to reach far and near through remote audits without obviously stepping out of our offices. As for the documentary review, security and confidentiality violations need to be taken into consideration, meaning documents, if it's considered confidential, need to be kept as such. There are potential difficulty in responding to documentation requests. As mentioned earlier, determine where and how documents and records will be exchanged. And of course, in a remote audit, there's a potential because again, you are not physically present at the site, so you are requesting for documents that are transmitted through some medium and could potentially face some data manipulations. And continuing on with the information and communication technology, surveys applications. Of course, those can be utilized in a case of a remote audit. Potential risk is filling out checklists and questionnaires. Risk, guarantee of authenticity, need to pre-develop checklists and possibly prepare respondents to answer them, which increases cost. However, there are some benefits and opportunities to that as well. Better knowledge of the organization, applicable at preparation stage of the audit. It allows to prepare audit work, which needs to be verified during the audit by gathering other evidence. It also allows for the organization to prepare to the on-site visit. Document data review. Again, e.g. web document review, viewing records, procedures, workflows, monitors, etc. This has, again, some security and confidentiality challenges, and there are some procedural difficulties in document being viewed, again, online. Increased time is required because of the logistical challenges associated with a remote audit. And again, opportunities and benefits, eases an organization and allows for a more flexible use of time by the auditee and the auditor. As mentioned earlier, once that is determined during preparation, then some flexibility can be built into the audit process that involves a remote audit. Additional examples of identification of risks and opportunities for using remote audit techniques. Using the video, monitoring of remote or high-risk work, guided site visits. Well, again, because we are not physically there at the site, so there is a propensity for the auditee, obviously, to direct you to where they want you to see from a video standpoint. Quality of image may not be quite adequate. As we all understand and have experienced, when it comes to Skype, when it comes to Teams, when it comes to some of this electronic method of video conferencing, there are some challenges and limitations when it comes to consistencies. However, there are some benefits as well as opportunities. Easy monitoring of high-risk tasks. You are able to increase sampling, and it's also ideal for auditing activities where the safety requirements do not allow the presence of the audit team. And it's also good for complementing field visits in outdoor activities, e.g. forecast and agricultural sites mining. And video, asynchronous, for an example, surveillance camera, video recordings. The potential risk is monitoring of activities that are not going at the time of the audit. Process videos, call center voice recordings, and recorded training webinars. Some risk associated with those are security, again, and confidentiality, quality of imaging, full appreciation of the site equipment and conditions, simply because we are not physically there at the site, and the veracity of the data. Opportunities and benefits, higher profitability, possibility of selecting only the moments of interest of the video, observing places, hard to reach facilities, and improving sampling. Of course, there are some times where logistically in a site audit, we run into difficulties, we get into some very, very remote areas. And also the electronic record may contain sensitive data that CSDP criteria considers not eligible for remote auditing. So in that particular case, we really do not have much of a choice but an on-site audit. Here are some helpful tips for auditor preparation. In essence, just a summary here. 1, develop a checklist. 2, review documentation before the audit. 3, identify documents needed for review during the audit. 4, explaining the audit process, agenda, and procedures to auditors and auditees. Very important. And then, of course, the professional attire and demeanor. Okay, thank you so much for your attention and for listening through this audit planning. Here is a knowledge check. Number 2, tailoring the agenda, timing, technology requirements, and logistics for conducting remote auditing activities is needed during COVID-19 pandemic. True or false? I will give you an opportunity to a few minutes here to respond to this question. Okay, very good. Yes, the answer to the question here, tailoring the agenda, timing, and technology requirement logistics for conducting remote audit is needed during COVID-19, and of course it's true. All right, very good. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Michelleanne, to take you through the audit conduct.
Hi, everyone. So this is Michelleanne Bradley, and we are going to talk about what we do during the conduct of a remote audit. And here are some of the challenges that we run into, is that we are not able to review hard copy originals of documents. This is less of an issue now than it used to be because a lot of us don't deal with hard copies anyway anymore. A lot of it is electronic, so there is that little bit of flexibility, but we'll get into where it's a little bit muckier in a minute. So we have to deal with digital photographs and videos versus an on-site tour because we can't be there, much to our chagrin. There are time zone differentiations. So for example, next week, I have an audit that I will be getting up at 4 a.m. to start because of the time zone differentiations, because this is the kind of commitment that we make when we're auditing, is to be there for the needs of the client, no matter what time zone we're in. And the biggest one for me is not being able to assess the body language and utilize the active listening skills that you get with a bigger picture of being in a room with people during the audit. Even having, the video screen activated doesn't give you the same impact and reading as being live in a room with someone. So these are some of the limitations. And it's also because of inspection readiness requirements, it's very difficult to give that assessment from a remote perspective. So if you're looking at inspection prep, which is a different nuance than an internal audit, we all know that when you walk into a site for say a mock inspection, you're looking for, from the moment that your hand is on the door, what the reaction is from the person who greets you at the front desk. Do they ask you for your documentation, for your identification? Do they ask you for the forms from the agency, which is all part of it? We can coach people on that, but there is an intimidation and a fear that comes, I think, when that's real, or a quickening and a nervousness. And coaching doesn't cut it for that, I don't believe. That's really something that you need to run through. So, moving along, here are some helpful tips for your auditors. Review your audit request. So, what are you going to be doing? Make sure that you have clearly defined boundaries of scope so that you know where you're going to be focusing, because these can be huge. Know your auditee. Review all the documentation related to them that you have access to. Request the contracts, request any interactions. What is the reason for the audit? And perform a technology check before you start the audit. In preparation for this webinar, we did a dry run to make sure that everyone could get on to the format of technology that we were using. And as an auditor, I've had multiple experiences where I go in to do a mock inspection. So I'm going in within that persona of an inspector, and there have been technology drops on the part of the company that I'm auditing, the auditees or the inspectees, as the case may be. And you want those parts to go very smoothly, because there are enough pieces that are very nerve-wracking. So just the basic run-throughs on these parts is very helpful, because then it's not something that'll rattle you later. And I know that during this time of quarantine and COVID, that we have seen a lot of discussion and everything about, kids and dogs. And I actually am living in fear that my 2 dogs are going to start barking any minute now. But try to quiet your surroundings. Real experience was doing another mock inspection that was handled remotely because we were getting ready for an EMA inspection, and someone was doing dishes in the background of one of the interviewees' spaces, and it was incredibly distracting. And we had to stop and have them go and ask that, maybe the dishes could wait until we were done with their interview piece. Introduce yourself. You are here to help the auditees. Like, we're not here as auditors to only find fault and only look for fault. We want everyone to succeed. Our end goal is to bring the best quality and safest products to the patients. The patients are our end goal, and we are here to help them to succeed. So these are some ground rules. Make sure that if you're going to be engaging with the webcam, that it's on. If it's not available, before the person speaks, before you start, jumping in, give your name and your title, because if there are multiple people on the line, it's difficult to discern who is speaking at the time. And as an auditor, we're often taking notes while we're presenting or while someone is responding, and we need to know to whom to address questions and comments. And mute your lines if you're not active. Inform that there will be gaps, okay? There will be gaps, there will be silences, because, like I said, the auditor is writing notes, the auditees are writing notes, the auditees may be searching for documentation or consulting with a colleague. The auditor may be verifying information, especially during interviews. So make sure that you understand that a pause isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's important to give recognition to that space. Be present, be engaged. This is an opportunity for us to learn things about our own organization, as well as to give feedback to the auditors. Some auditors you like better than others. If you do audits yourself, you may say, hey, this is something that I would like to emulate. This is something that I would not like to emulate. Be polite. I had a mock inspection where one of the interviewees referred to me as Dear Inspector. It's not appropriate. So be polite. And this is a learning opportunity for everyone. Just to reiterate, make sure that you ask questions. Asking questions is almost more important and relevant during a remote audit than an in-person audit, because, like I said, back earlier with the reference to body language, if we're in the same room and you have a question, I can see that you have a question, and so I may call you out and say, did you have a question that I can answer? And ask for clarification, communicate regarding the progress of the audit and the challenges. Make sure that you utilize all of that information. And everyone will be in attendance for the closeout meeting, and all of the findings will be reviewed with the auditees. This is the time to discuss all of that. Moving along. An agenda is going to be very much the same as an on-site audit. There'll be an opening session, the scope will be discussed, the process, technology review, there will be break time built in. Expectation is, and again, this is almost more critical than when we're in a face-to-face audit, to have the documentation that has been requested ready before the audit gets started. There will be a daily summary. There will be time for review of documents. This may be slightly more challenging, and I said that we would discuss that later, and here it is. We need to confirm agreements and permissions during the planning phase of the audits for screenshots, photos, video tours, but also for document review. Confirm the availability and feasibility of technology. Will there be a need for breakout rooms if there's more than one auditor? Will we be doing live streaming from smartphones? Will there be screen sharing? How are we going to be using instant messaging and chats during the audit? Is that necessary? And how will the cloud sharing for documentation be utilized? How will the facility tours go? Will it just be a screenshot of floor plans, confirmations, requested photographs, and live stream from smartphones? A lot of this is very repetitive because it applies in multiple areas, and we've all seen the basic technology drops. Document reviews that will be included in the agenda will include organizational charts, SOPs, study documents, training records, CVs, protocols, contracts, agreements, and floor plans. We need to make sure that we follow the agenda timing and allow for the necessary feedback and touch points with the auditees. There could be 3 to 5 minute pauses as auditors and auditees are looking at documents. If there is a need for ad hoc interviews, give as much notice as possible, especially as there are so many of us who are remote at this time. Tips for the auditee, same as for an on-site audit: test all of the technology, train and equip the staff for remote audit agenda, flow, response times, documents, technology, etc. Resources, this is a little bit more challenging on the auditee side, because you will still need the primary person who is the auditee, so the primary person who is interacting with the auditor, plus the scribe who is taking notes on everything, plus who is the runner, who is the back room. So, and you don't want the audit lead to also be the scribe and searching for documents, because then those 3 to 5 minute breaks in conversation, or the 3 to 5 minute silences, will grow exponentially. So it's really critical that we have multiple people assigned on the auditee side, and there will still be the daily debrief meetings and the planning meetings. Communicate to the auditor documents that are not able to be provided prior to the audit, and go through the daily review of outstanding documents for the auditor. From a leadership perspective, let the team know that this is an exercise to ensure success. This is an opportunity for improvement. The goals are to provide the best services, products, and treatments for subjects and patients. I cannot emphasize this piece enough. We are here to provide patient services. We are here to provide patient products. So from the audit lead perspective, you want to ensure that the staffing team focus on quiet area for interviews, test the technology before the audit, communicate the challenges and obstacles with the remote audit team, and confirm all evaluations and findings with the auditor. And that'll happen at the end of the audit or at the end of each day. So here's your little quiz for the end of this section. Which of the following are needed for a successful remote audit? And this is a select all that apply. So I'm going to give you a moment to fill this out. And if we want to give the responses, excellent.
So yes, they all apply, everyone. So bingo,
Right.
everybody. I'm looking at the numbers. It looks like everybody rocked it. Thank you. Okay, I didn't want to step on your toes.
No, you're doing great. Thanks.
And now we're going to go on to the audit report.
Thank you for your patience. And we are moving on to audit reporting. And in an audit report, of course, this is the time you want to share the work you've done in the course of the remote audit, not only with your boss, but also with the auditee. So it's important that the audit report is very, very clear by, again, reinstating the scope and the objectives of the audit. And this could easily be deduced from the actual audit plan, other than obviously stating this in a past tense. And the first portion of the audit report, after the scope and the objective have been reinstated, is the executive summary. So providing a very high-level summary of the audit experience, including the participants in the audit for the opening and closing meetings, the auditee's company's overview, and if this is related to a specific study protocol, it will be helpful to state what that protocol is. In other words, the protocol number and title. And then if there is any critical finding, it will be worthy of mention here during the executive summary. Confidentiality and security is also important, that should be highlighted in a section within the audit report describing the agreements, the permissions, and the methods used during the audit. For an example, screenshots, photos, videos, and so on and so forth. It is also important to restate what technology was available and used during the meeting and the actual audit conduct. Facility tour, where what type of tour was performed? Was it using the video cam or the webcam and actually seeing the floor plan of the facility remotely? Was it used Google Maps? If drones were used for the survey of the facility, it should be stated here under the facility tour. And if necessary, indicate how many hours it took to obviously cover these areas. Document reviews. Provide a list of documents and records with version number and or effective dates. The reason why this is really, really important is that oftentimes when individuals omit to list the documents reviewed during the audit, it can pose a challenge further down the line. When there is an issue with an area that was actually audited and evaluated and documents not noted, when an FDA inspection occurs and they identify issues in those areas, it's not clear to actual auditee as to why those issues were not identified by the auditor or the contracted auditor. So it's important to list the documents and the records reviewed during the audit, so individual or the auditee in this case is able to determine what areas and what records we actually evaluated against future audits. And of course, the elements audited that are stated in the audit plan, whatever those elements are, whether it's training, whether it's validation, whether it's the EDC, these are the areas that are important to, again, be noted as outlined in the audit plan, and provide some details around each of those elements. And of course, if due to time constraints, one is unable to complete or evaluate all the elements audited, or rather all the elements contained within the audit plan, it would be helpful to note what those ones are. So for the audit report, it's important to specify what the audit findings are and categorize them in a manner that the SOP requires. For an example, whether the audit finding is a critical, major, or minor, it should be annotated as such. And of course, objective evidences related to why this is considered a critical, major, or minor finding should be well delineated on the audit report. And of course, if it's a recommendation or an opportunity for improvement, it should be stated as such. Again, making it very clear to the auditee on what is required in terms of their responses to the audit findings, whether it's a finding or a recommendation. And then, of course, the summary and appendices. Conclusion from the audit, provide a very short conclusion as to if the audit was successful and what are the hiccup points, and what, again, restating what the critical findings are. And of course, everything about an audit shouldn't be about the negatives or the findings. If there are some very good observations that were noted during the audit, it should also be stated in the summary. And of course, in the audit report should be the auditor's signature, name, and date. And it's preferred that these are done with wet ink signatures as opposed to simply typing in or an electronic signature. But of course, if it is a validated electronic signature, that would also be acceptable. Audit finding forms. Well, why this is very, very important is take for an example of an investigator site. Most of the investigator sites do not maintain or corrective action plan and templates or audit finding templates. So when you are able to provide them an audit finding in an audit finding form that contains some of the actual observation and findings, and perhaps also have a section there that would allow them to respond adequately, it really goes a long way, especially for organizations, as I mentioned, like an investigate site where they do not actually, in some cases, maintain some of these templates within their document archives. And then, of course, route the audit report. So consider it a draft until you've had an opportunity to route it for review and approval where indicated. This could be internal, of course, but also it's not a common practice, obviously, to send the audit report as a draft to an auditee with the assumption that during the closing meeting that audit findings were clearly discussed and agreed upon, so that when the report is issued, there shouldn't be much of a pushback from the auditee. Audit classifications, as I mentioned earlier, typically come in three categories here: minor, major, or critical. And if it's a minor finding, this should not come as a surprise, as they would have been discussed during the conduct closeout meeting. This is really, really important if you do not want to get into a situation where you start to go back and forth with the auditee as to what the findings were. Is very, very important to be very clear during your closing meeting and even through the course of the audit conduct as to what observations or findings are being identified in the course of the audit. This will really alleviate a lot of headache once the report is published with the audit findings. And for the critical, it needs to be addressed immediately. When it comes to a critical finding, if again, organizations have different definition for what is considered major, minor, and critical, but for the most part, there are some industry standards that are maintained in the ISO document. So the critical, as we know it, are things that could potentially derail a study or halt a study or significant deviation from the protocol. And so in a critical finding, you certainly need the auditee to address that immediately so that it does not derail, in the case of a clinical study, the actual progress of the study. Again, next steps with audit findings. Remember that there is not an expectation of perfection during an audit. Just bear in mind, there may be some slight deficiencies here and there. In terms of the audit agenda, all the elements listed within the audit may not be completely covered, but it's okay as long as it's noted as to what those are. Again, we are all humans, and so are the inspectors, even from the FDA agency. Auditors and regulatory agency inspectors alike want the products to succeed, as my colleague, Michelleanne, indicated earlier. As long as we have that in mind and work very closely with the auditee, oftentimes the objective of the audit will be accomplished. It is a learning exercise. Take advantage of the time and the opportunity. Now, another knowledge check. And I'm expecting you all to perform as good as you did last time. Remote auditing activities require less documentation in the audit report than an on-site audit report. True or false? We'll give you a few moments again to respond to this.
Okay, responses are coming in. There you go.
Very good. Very good performance. There we go. So we have 98%. Well, thank you for your responses. And we move on to the very next section, which is a follow-up. So I will hand it over to my colleague, Michelleanne.
Okay, and I am back for follow-up. This is going to be super quick. So we do team follow-up, observations and recommendations, discussion with the team and upper management. Were there any surprises? Follow-up calls and document review, document in the report any follow-up calls as part of the audit, and documents that need to be reviewed later. And there will be a formal follow-up letter, as well as the audit certificate and CAPA follow-up for company procedures.
And in summary, we just want to share with you some key points. Planning, 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 and preparation is key for the resources, both at the company as well as the auditee. We talked about really nailing down that technology, practicing with it, making sure it works. Recognizing that remote audits can take longer than an on-site audit, and actually put that in to your planning. We also talked about the criticality of those confidentiality and security measures, not only for the individuals giving permission to be on webcam, but also for all of your documents, your document repositories. And then again, maintaining those touch points with the audit lead. Oftentimes we're finding in remote audits, sometimes the timing can go off. So again, making sure you're continuously having those touch points with the audit lead that you pre-identify before you start. And it's very important also to recognize that in order to execute, flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. And again, making sure we're actually with the auditees now, in addition to the audit lead, we are communicating in real time. And we also noted that having that document request form and posting it somewhere, or saying you're going to send it by email, we are finding that people like that inside of a central location such as Teams or SharePoint, because staff can go in there during the day or time you're conducting the audit, or if they're in different time zones, when they come into the office, they can address that really quickly, as opposed to putting things in emails, and actually helps them to track it. So we found great success with that. Communication skills, as we discussed, are really critical and really need to pay attention to the platform you're in. And we really talked about that. And what I really liked was that Michelleanne talked about there are going to be pauses, and let them know that ahead of time. and making sure that you can access those documents, that the auditee is able to do things. So in the planning, we discussed doing that feasibility assessment, and then we had the risk and opportunities assessment came from Azuh. A lot more planning goes into this for a successful, timely audit. And then finally, we understand documenting in our audit reports. But we also learned that we really had to add those details of what is conducted in a remote audit, that it actually describes what happened, the use of a webcam, the use of SharePoint. Also, did you use any smartphones for some video tours, etc.? And again, all the agreements made for the confidentiality and security as we discussed. And then recognizing that you have to document in your report when you have to go on site and what you have to document about what needs to be documented on site, what you weren't able to do, or your comfort level with some of maybe the remote facility tours. The Azuh guidance gave you some very good points in that conclusion section that Matt reviewed for you about some of the very specific conclusions you can have with that remote audit. So we recommend you include that as well. And then finally, the usual follow-up, your audit certificates, the audit findings to the team according to your company procedures. And when you're working with your vendors, we recognize that those procedures and processes for your follow-up are going to be the same, but you always have to confirm and verify, is there anything else you need to do differently because it was a remote audit? And that is a very individual assessment. And then finally, by planning, executing, documenting, and doing your follow-up, and of course you're going to follow up on your CAPAs, you're assessing and focusing on good clinical practices, human subject protection, ethics, and local laws. What we'd like for you to do now is, could you share with us one thing that you learned during this webinar that you would like to take back on to your job? That would be really helpful for other people. So if you all could just post that really quickly. I'm going to open up the Q&A box, and I took some notes from some chat questions that came in earlier. That would be great. And then if there are any other topics you're interested in for us to address in the future, you can place that into the chat box as well. Depth of communication and the report is important. Look at this, everybody, in your chat box. The request log, the depth of communication, the report, a mock dry run before the real virtual occurs, awareness that different platforms can be hacked and it's not appropriate for them for audit, so you have to really look at that security level. Very good point. Preparation, rehearsal, confidentiality, request for permission to be on camera. Yeah, that really goes globally. And then adding more information for remote audits in my procedures. And then also someone shared, wow, I know how better to prepare my vendors for remote audits. Again, we just have a summary of our services, and now we're going to get into our questions here. One of the questions we had is, in my past experience, most auditees have policies prohibiting photos or video recording. Is this a new environment, or have you seen a change in this philosophy? Matt and Michelleanne, do you have any comments on that for us? I think we have to follow those procedures from the vendor, but then we would probably have to know what has to be done on site. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is Michelleanne. That is correct, that there would need to be some sort of workaround on that particular point for these kinds of audits. So like, you may be able to view the photos of the area during a share, but not have copies of them.
Okay, great, thank you. And then another individual wrote, I gather that remote audit scope is to be the same as the on-site audit. And I believe that is correct, but I thought I would let you all reply to that as well.
That is correct.
PV audits generally tend to be extensive. Has there been any discussions to tailor the scope of a PV audit in light of the limitations due to COVID-19? I know you're a PV expert there, Michelleanne.
Yes, so actually, no, there is no curtailing of PV audits. I actually find that because PV audits can be very much done remotely, because we're looking at documentation and systems, that a big bulk of what is done on a PV audit is done before you're actually in front of someone and then after. So no, there wouldn't be modifications, but there have been some updates to reporting during the time of COVID by pretty much all of the health authorities and reporting agencies. So depending on who you're looking to report to, I would check, or you can message us at YourEncore and we can provide more information on that.
Great, thank you so much. And then also, one of the points people talked about is external suppliers audits. And are there any helpful additional points of reference either one of you would want to provide? I know our webinar was very robust, but is there anything else you would like to share as a lessons learned perhaps?
Is this from a supplier audit standpoint?
Yes, they're going to do an external supplier audit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's sort of reflected in some of the areas we highlighted during this presentation. There are some critical processes, for example, such as reference laboratories, and the suppliers in this case are sort of flexing to a point where you can do remote now and then come back later and finish up with on-site audit. So sort of divided into two. I've seen that especially with laboratories, because there are just some things you can't remotely execute from an audit standpoint.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to turn this back over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope that you found some value in this presentation. I know we've already been fielding a lot of requests in the chat feature for the presentation itself. So just a reminder to everyone on the line that we will be sending you an email with a recording to the presentation. So we welcome you to share that with your colleagues. And I give special thanks to you, Liz, Matt, and Michelleanne for an excellent presentation today. So happy to have you bring your thought leadership and your expertise to our clients and our professional colleagues. So thank you so much, everyone. We look forward to bringing you another webinar in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You all have a great day.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks for joining us.